I had 2 months to get my life together, get a job, get an apartment, all that kind of stuff for us to start our lives together. And so there's a lot of pressure. And for some context, I'm a Christian. So it was definitely a test of faith and kind of, okay, can I make this work? I thought every coder like knew everything. That's not the reality, at least not back then. Did a lot of work to get that app off the ground. And when it launched, it actually was pretty successful. We ended up getting featured on the front page of the Apple App Store, and we had 40,000 downloads in like a few days.
Welcome to the show, Joshua. How are you doing?
Hey, doing all right. How you doing, Mark?
Very good, very good. Thank you for asking and thank you for being here. I've been looking forward to talking to you. You have a very interesting journey and your entrepreneurial ventures have gone in a way that is uncharacteristic, but also a usual story of pivots and struggles and
Yeah.
overcoming obstacles that just came out of nowhere. Would you agree?
Yeah, definitely not necessarily overcoming obstacles, but I would say navigating them and trying to
Navigating.
find the path with least resistance, but also that is interesting.
Yeah, love it.
Yeah.
We're going to go through your whole journey, but before that, tell our listeners a little bit about what are you doing now?
Sure. So my primary job is I'm the CEO of Go Architect. So we're a design and technology firm here in Chicago. So I live right downtown. Chicago is a great place to be involved with anything architecture related. And we do a lot of work with school districts, with governments, basically organizations who are looking to design, build, plan for new buildings. And a lot of this has to, of course, come in the context of what the public wants, what the community needs. So some of those needs and desires and balancing that out with what can we afford, what do we even have the physical space to do, things like that. So we do a lot of public projects, but then we also create a lot of technology to help us do those projects better.
And is it true that since 2018, you have helped organizations with over $14 billion in investment and design?
Yes. So basically, what happens is that whenever we have a project, for example, for a school district, we are helping them plan the next, let's say, 10 years worth of new buildings, upgrades, renovations, that kind of stuff. And obviously, a school can include many types of buildings, classrooms, gyms, cafeterias, that kind of thing. And building is definitely not a cheap venture. And so things add up pretty quickly. And so you have to be careful. You have to prioritize. You have to help your client or the public entity prioritize. So, yeah, we've been involved in helping a lot of organizations prioritize millions, hundreds of millions of dollars of potential work into something that they can actually achieve.
Amazing, amazing. Through this podcast, we talk to extremely successful people who appear like gods, right?
Mm.
And you yourself sitting there in Chicago doing all this amazing work, you're intimidating to somebody listening to this podcast thinking, oh, I will never be like Joshua. But for those of
Mm.
us who have gone through the entrepreneurial journey, we know the blood, sweat, lots of tears that we have to put through to get where we are today. So I wanted to start with where you are now to
Sure.
show the impact that you're creating. But now I want to go back to the beginning and carve out the path, what it was like for Joshua to graduate
Mm.
college in 2014 with a master's in architecture, doe-eyed, believing the magic in the war. And then from 2014 to 2024, these 10 years, how did you go from
Yeah.
there? So tell me a little bit about you graduated college, master's in architecture degree. What were you thinking at the time? What were your
Yeah.
goals, visions at the time?
It's definitely been a 10-year journey. So I graduated from Andrews University in Southwest Michigan. It's a small private school. My graduate class was maybe 20, 25 people, so pretty small. And basically what happened was I graduated in May. I my parents gave me their very old minivan as a graduation gift, and I drove to California where my girlfriend slash fiance, we were engaged. So I drove to California in May, basically arrived with no job, nothing, stayed at a friend's house on his couch for a couple of weeks. And I drove around to architecture firms and basically wherever I could think of to apply for work because my fiance and I were getting married at the end of July. So I had 2 months to get my life together, get a job, get an apartment, all that kind of stuff for us to start our lives together. And so there's a lot of pressure. And for some context, I'm a Christian, so it was definitely a test of faith and kind of, okay, can I make this work? And I ended up finding a job in a place I did not expect. I found it with a health technology startup, and I basically earned practically nothing. So I earned like $24,000 a year. And the idea was that this health tech startup was going to get big, it's going to explode, and we were all going to be successful. And it did not turn out that way. They had all kinds of plans and ideas that did not work. And they actually are an interesting case study of not focusing on something that worked. They're a lesson learned case study. But I was there, and very fortunately, though, I still had the time to go to networking events. One of the actual other offices in the same building I worked in on a different floor was an architecture firm. So I would run into them, the elevator, and I had interviewed with other places in town. Even though I did not get those jobs, I kind of knew the HR managers and things like that. And so after a year of being at that health tech startup, I saw the writing on the wall and I was like, this place is not going to last much longer. I need to get out while I can. And so I reached out to a group that I had interviewed with, but they had not given me the job. And I said, hey, I'm leaving my current position. Do you by any chance, can I have a second chance at the interview? Because it had gone, they just had not hired me for whatever reason. And so they said yes. I did the interview again and I got that job the second time. So it was good. That bridge wasn't burned and all that kind of stuff. And it was great because I literally doubled my salary because I went from being a marketing assistant or whatever in some startup to an actual office. I was very happy to earn more money and actually work in the field that I went to school with.
So this
And
is now
then
teen,
this is, yeah, end of 2015,
end
give
of
or take.
2015. So you have
Yeah.
worked a year at this startup that didn't go anywhere. Did you learn
Yeah.
anything useful there?
I learned a lot about what not to do, I would say. They, without giving too much away about them, but basically they had a product that they had done a Kickstarter for, and it had gone really well. They had raised like $500,000 on Kickstarter. And instead of using that money to actually finish the product, they basically leveraged it to go after investment funding, which was fine. But they used that investment funding for their, I would say, family of products rather than the actual one that they were successful with on Kickstarter. And so when I found them in 2014, they were still riding high off of this Kickstarter campaign and they're all pumped about this thing. But then you arrive and you actually, of course, get the inside scoop and you realize, oh no, they're like focused on all these other random things that are cost a lot of money. And to give you some examples, they were always indecisive about random stuff. For example, when I showed up and worked for the marketing director, we had hired a PR firm. And then 2 weeks later, they fired this PR firm. And of course, the PR firm has like a cancellation fee. So that was like a $20,000 cancellation fee. And then they hired another one and canceled that. And then they eventually hired one from Chicago who I remember really distinctly only flew business class. And so they would fly out to California in business class. And my boss was always angry. And these are tens of thousands of dollars just going out the door for quite literally no work, just in cancellation and travel fees, right? So there were just a lot of those types of things where they acted much bigger than they actually were. And
Yeah.
they burned through a lot of cash and a lot of time. So, yeah.
That lesson you learned, right? Where money
Mm,
was just being wasted.
yeah,
Let's quickly come back to 2024.
sure.
Current day. How are you using that lesson to guide your business decisions right now?
I think to a certain extent, you have to take risks, but you also have to live within your means and you have to grow your business within the means that you have to do that. And financially is a pretty concrete way, right? If you're going into massive amounts of debt to take on some new venture, you better be sure that the risk and reward is there. You better be sure that the percentage of accomplishment or the likelihood of accomplishment is high. And if you want to take risks and make an investment and it doesn't pay off, okay, I get it, right? Business, you make mistakes or things don't work out. I think what's wasteful is when you make decisions that have no return and have no real potential that ever were going to make return. And hiring random consultants and things like that is a pretty common way that people make that mistake, right? They think the consultant is going to fix all of the problems and is going to provide some great insight when ideas in general are not worth that much. What's worth actually a lot is the execution of an idea. And that's not necessarily what consultants do, right? So, yeah, I don't know. I think it's maybe that's a long way of saying just be a better steward of what you have and take risks, but make risks that actually make sense for you.
And it's so crazy because this seems like such a simple thing, but so many startups mess this up because there's a very big difference in between intellectually understanding something and emotionally being able to accept it,
Oh, yeah.
right?
And it's
It is
very attractive to make that mistake sometimes. You want to hire the cool consultant or Instagram whatever to spin your product. It's, oh, wow, that sounds so cool until
yeah.
you realize what's the ROI on this?
Yeah. I always say that a lot of times I've seen startup CEOs almost become like kids with toys when they have all this money. They're just like buying
Yeah.
things and doing things just because they have all this money they didn't have, and it's their
Yeah.
opportunity to interact with that Instagram influencer or the consultant that they could have never had. There's a lesson here, definitely, and I'm glad you shared it. Okay, let's go back to 2015 now. You were talking about the lessons that you learned from the company that you exited.
Yeah, it was definitely an experience of what not to do. Some benefits were that because it was a health tech startup, we did have people coming in the office like the mayor and economic development people and other investors. So, in a way, it was helpful to get to know some of the leaders in town. For some context, I lived in Southern California in a city called Riverside, which is not like a huge city. So, the number of people that are interacting with the startup world is pretty small. You can generally fit them in one room. So it was helpful to make those connections and to at least be introduced to the local people that were doing stuff. And when I left for the architecture firm, I took that entrepreneurial energy that I've always had and I took some of those lessons and I tried to make that as part of my job at the firm, even though it was a much more like traditional job, let's say. One thing that happened there, though, that was pretty interesting was at the time, I really wasn't a programmer, wasn't really any type of coder at all. And I came up with the idea where we could create a app to help high school students find their future career. So it's like a Tinder for finding your future career. And you would have these career cards and you could swipe left or right depending on if you like the career or not. You could tap the card and it would flip over and show you things like salary, how many years you might have to go to college, and then some general, is it indoor, outdoor? Is it more about science or more about humanities? So it had these kind of characteristics things. And I pitched this idea to my boss as a marketing tool for us to show school districts that we were basically trying to innovate in the education space. We were
Mhm.
trying to help them with their engagement of students. And so somehow he went along with it and said, okay. And so I was challenged to make this app, and I fortunately had time at work to make it. In all honesty, though, I worked on it at work and at home just for 3 months straight because I did not know all of the coding things that I needed to make or needed to know in order to make it, which in retrospect is pretty normal. I thought every coder like knew everything. That's not the reality, at least not back then. Did a lot of work to get that app off the ground. And when it launched, it actually was pretty successful. We ended up getting featured on the front page of the Apple App Store, and we had 40,000 downloads in like a few days. And it actually turned out really well. So it was a nice kind of validation of all of the months of time.
So let's talk about that, right? First of all, as a programmer myself, I have a background in I'm a software engineer. In my
Mm.
previous life, I was a software engineer. We don't know all that code, right? It's just we
No.
figure it out as we go. We look it up as we go. It's
Yeah.
impossible to know all that stuff, right? You went to school for architecture. You had these dreams and desires associated with buildings, with building physical things. And now you've
Yeah.
found yourself in a spot where you have a creative idea and you pitch that creative idea to your boss. And all of a sudden, you are now responsible for learning a completely different skill set that you have
Yeah.
never learned before. What did that feel like? Did that feel like a chore? Did it feel like, oh my God, if I wanted to be a coder, I could have gone to school to be a computer science person, but I spent all these years and a master's degree not to do this? Or did you have a different perspective?
Oh, my perspective was 100% I really want to learn how to do this. And there
Why
were
is
a
that?
couple factors. So I had the architecture job, let's say the day-to-day responsibilities. And I noticed that many architecture firms do basically the same thing. Sure, you might come out with a different design and there are some subtle differences, but for the most part, any reasonably talented and adept person or firm can do a good job. So, what makes the actual difference? And a lot of times that comes to how they're listening to the client, maybe political connections, intelligence with finance, all that kind of stuff. And so I was searching for what can we do that's a little different to stand out from the other architecture firms in our city and say that we're thinking a little bit more equally. And so when I thought about that, and then I also thought about what skills I personally wanted to have, I wanted to learn how to program because it's like most things that we take advantage of now either did not exist or brand new. Airbnb was still basically new, Instagram was basically brand new. Even Facebook had not been played out with. Like most people were still using Facebook on a day-to-day basis. Like all of the big things were basically brand new or almost new. Apple had literally just invented the Swift programming language, so that was also brand new. So there's a lot of desire around creating apps specifically. I wanted to learn how to create apps. So I took those kind of two things and said, okay, what can we do? Now the problem was I didn't even own a Mac. So I didn't have access to Xcode, and most architecture software is not available on a Mac anyway. So we all just had PCs. So I was like, how can I get somebody else to pay for my MacBook while I perfect all of these programming skills? And again, very fortunately, my boss at the time was willing to take a risk and bought the MacBook. It was a work computer and gave me time in the office to work on it. So I would say I do owe a lot to him in a way because he encouraged that type of innovation. And maybe he had never seen it before and it was brand new to him too. So he was also curious. I will say, maybe going back to that health tech startup, when I worked on this project at my architecture firm, they could afford to take a risk. For me to work for a couple months on something that wasn't a billable project was okay because they already had their core competency and everything like that figured out. So it wasn't as big of a company shaking risk to spend some time creating an app and seeing where it goes.
Interesting. So you worked for a startup that didn't operate like a startup, but you worked for a traditional company that took startup ideas, and
Ideas,
the
yes.
rest was history.
In a way, that was just the beginning. That app did get some traction. We were able to use it as a marketing tool, etc. But at the end of the day, it was still an architecture firm. And so the lifespan of that project was limited. And so when I completed it and stopped working on like the launch of it, we eventually did have to go back. And so I worked at that firm for about 2 years and was always popping in and out of kind of this entrepreneurial role back to regular architecture role. On the side, I had started to be more involved with the local entrepreneur community in Riverside. So I helped out with something called the Riverside CEO Forum. It's like a technology, basically a get together of CEOs who worked in technology in the area,
Mhm.
which really just turned out to be like a therapy session, which is fine, right? Whatever. So I ran those therapy sessions for a year and a half or so. And it was an interesting time. I learned a lot. I was working a lot of hours because I was always trying to learn things after work and on weekends and things like that. But I would say it did set up a lot of things. The one thing I will say that sets up the next part of the story is that one of my project managers, he and I were put on a project called a facility master plan. And I had no idea what that was, but we were the only two people on it. And so we worked with the school district to create this facilities master plan. And because it was just the two of us and I was the junior employee, I did practically everything. And so I was there at the community meetings, I was there with the other partners. And by chance, I was at these meetings with other architects, and one of the other gentlemen that was there turned out to be my next boss at my next job. So just by chance, I got introduced to this kind of niche and I got introduced to the next person that I would work with.
Interesting. This seems to be a pattern, and I'm very curious about that, right? You have a voracious hunger to learn, right? And you're constantly finding yourself in situations where I don't really know what to do, and you're trying to figure it out. And as a
Yeah.
result, you're learning immensely.
Yeah,
Where
definitely.
does this trait come from? Is this something that who you are as a person, or is this a trained behavior?
Interesting. I think it's a little bit of both. I've always been pretty curious, loved traveling to different neighborhoods in the city that I live in. I will routinely just bike around into new neighborhoods that I've never gone into. And it's not like I'm going there to go to a restaurant or a store. I'm just literally going there to go to the place. So I think I've always been curious with that. I think over time, it's become more obvious to me that the world is created with these very interesting pockets and you don't necessarily always interact with them, but you can catch like glimpses of these pockets of people's lives. And to me, it's interesting to peek inside and see what's going on. And I've done that with a lot of stuff. I do rock climbing, I rollerblade, like all these kinds of stuff. And I don't just rollerblade by myself. I join a rollerblading club and it's 30 people and we get together and we skate around Chicago. Or you join a rock climbing gym and there's dozens of people there climbing together. So there's these little subcultures and I like interacting with them and seeing what they're like. And same thing applies to work. It's always just been curious to me how people do their jobs and what it's like. And I don't know what people are like that do certain jobs.
I love it. So, when you were a kid, going back to say middle school or high school, how would you describe
Mm.
yourself? Were you the jock on the football team that everybody's attracted to? Were you like me? I was a shy nerd kid in the back of the class with my computer and books, and I didn't want to talk to
Yeah.
anybody. Where in that spectrum of those two extremes, where would you say you were?
Yeah, somewhere in the middle. I definitely wasn't shy, but I wouldn't say I was in front of anyone. I went to a school in North Carolina for high school. It was a pretty small place. My class was 20 boys and 20 girls. There's only 40 of us, so everyone, and you hang out with some of them and some people you don't, but you're all just in there together. There's
Yeah,
not much of a hierarchy necessarily.
yeah.
And so I think that was good. I acknowledged that I had advantages that other people did not. So my parents were not wealthy in other means, but I was fortunate that my grandmother, she was a school teacher and she saved money and all these kinds of things. And she loved to travel. And so I was always going places with her, exploring different cities or even countries. And I think that gives you a lot of perspectives if you can go to other places and again see how people live and have the insight into their life bubble.
Yeah.
So I think that was helpful. And I will say that not many people, at least that I grew up with, had those opportunities. And it wasn't even about money. There were people that were far more well off than my family, but they stayed at home. They didn't go anywhere. They didn't have summer jobs or do summer camps in different places. I don't know. For some reason, they just didn't have the same curiosity. So it's not even about money. I think a lot of times
In
that's
our
it.
entire conversation here, one thing that keeps coming up over and over again is curiosity. And
Yeah.
I think the fact that you shared things about your family members who basically came from the same neighborhood, same environment, same socio-economic structure, and the difference between how they went about things and how you went about things, again, was
Yeah.
curiosity. Adulting is a process where every year you become less curious. We learn to stop dreaming. We learn to reduce our dreaming ability every year because when you're a kid, you are forever curious and you're a big dreamer. But as we start adulting, we become more and more practical. And it's the
Sure.
more and more practicality of life that stops us from joining a rollerblade group. Just be like,
Yeah.
I want to see what it's like. And instead,
Yeah.
they're like, I'm tired and I should be doing this thing instead. It is fascinating to me that this unique thread through your whole life until now that you have shared is the never ending curiosity to want to learn how to code, to want to get on a project that you know nothing about and figure it out. So, this is fascinating.
I think you're onto something. And I think it does become easier to not be curious because you feel There are some practical things like you do become busier if you get married or have kids or things like that. So, on a practical level, yeah, there are limitations that you don't have as a younger person. But in general, yeah, I think staying curious is, at least for me, it's a source of great joy, right? Now, do you want me to go back to 2015?
No, let's go back to 2017 now. You are put on
Okay,
this project.
2017.
There's you and your project manager, right?
Yeah.
And you have been given the brunt of the task because you're
Yeah.
the junior guy. What's going on right now in your life?
Yeah.
What's happening?
So the end of 2017 was interesting because basically it was the end of my relationship with the job I had. So the project manager that I'd worked with that I really liked, who introduced me to the facility master plans, he left. And you know what they say that people don't leave jobs, they leave managers kind of thing. And that statement is very true. When he left, everything changed. I was alone basically in my little corner and I was like being passed around to different project managers and I never found the vibe again. And he left several months before I did, but it was a clear like demarcation. Okay, this place isn't going to work anymore. And basically in the end of 2017, I was looking for something new. And the one of the other leaders in a different firm that I had sat across the table with during one of these facility master plan projects, I reached out to him and I was like, "Hey, I'm looking for something new. I worked with you on this project. Could I come talk to you?" And immediately the answer was yes. And fortunately, that project that we had been together on went well. Maybe he had also seen the app that I had made and heard about it. He's aware of me. And honestly, we hit it off. I went to talk to him. I met with some of the other leaders of that office, and it was a start to something great. And I started there basically at the end of 20. And that actually was, I didn't know it at the time, but that was an interesting turning point because when I started there, I was not hired as a junior employee, right? At that point, I had 2-ish years of experience, but I specifically had experience with these facility master planning projects. And part of the pitch that I made for myself was I also was a programmer. And so I was put on kind of these R&D projects within the corporation. So it was a large firm called DLR Group, which is like a 1,000+ person architecture firm. So I was put on these R&D projects and it was great. We played around with different types of marketing. We played around with different types of websites and projects and data analysis and design. And I was able to do like community meetings and all this kinds of stuff. So it was a good experience. Now, I was still working for somebody else, which was always something that I wanted to avoid. But the actual job and the culture and that I respect the DLR group team a lot. So it was a good transition away from the previous experience. And yeah, it was a good start to something new. So I appreciate that transition, made some good contacts, learned a lot of things. And what happened was the project manager that I had, his name is Kevin. So Kevin and I were working on these facility master plans that I've mentioned a few times now. And just like the previous job, in a way, I was searching for ways to improve it. How can we make it more efficient internally? How can we make it better for the client? Clearly, these projects have room for improvement, and they are such a specific niche of architecture that there's not like a ton of people thinking about this. It's not, if you use a simpler example, for a couple of years there, everyone was designing a new photo sharing app. And it was, dear goodness, please spend your energy elsewhere. We don't need another photo
Mhm.
sharing app. It was the opposite of that. Nobody was thinking about it. Nobody was working on it. Nobody even cared. And I think maybe that's a good entrepreneurial lesson is there are a lot of things in the world that nobody is thinking about. And in some cases, that maybe that's a good thing because there's a lot of stuff that's not worth thinking about.
Yeah.
But I bet you there's an equal number of things that are good businesses or are good social impact or nonprofit opportunity. It
Yeah.
doesn't have to only be about making money. It can also be about service. But I think there's a ton of stuff that people are not thinking about or not trying to innovate on. And so this was one of those things. And so Kevin and I basically just took this as an opportunity to see what we could figure out. And so I took that programming knowledge from the previous projects, I took the design knowledge, the architecture, all of that kind of stuff, combined it, and we started to basically find new ways to make these master plans as good as we possibly can. And when I decided that it was a good time to start my own firm, Kevin was my first client and DLR Group was my first client because they knew I could do the work. They knew that I was thinking about how to innovate on all these things. And so it was a natural transition to obviously hold on to them and for them to also agree to continue working with me, even though at that point, I was a single person and they're 1,000-person firm. So it was a huge differential in
Yeah.
power and wealth and all that kind of stuff, but
Yeah.
it was still worth it.
No, I love it. And here's another thing that is a realization for me, and I hopefully realization for the listeners as well. You
Mhm,
love to work. And every entrepreneur
mhm.
that I have met are passionate about working. In today's world, especially, entrepreneurship is seen mistakenly as almost a way to get out of working. Oh, I
Oh,
hate
yeah,
my
man.
job. Let me become an entrepreneur. And then I can just sit on the beach and drink Kool-Aid all day, margaritas all day, and never have to work. You have never shied away from working. You have never shied away from wanting to learn, to put yourself in an uncomfortable position and just
Yeah,
try to see what you can do. And
yeah,
the second lesson here is also a very classic entrepreneurial lesson that when you do pour yourself into work, and you approach it with honesty and dedication. When you do decide to go on your own, most entrepreneurs will tell you that their very first client was somebody that they already knew, that they already had relationships with, they were
yeah,
already working for, maybe a friend, maybe a family member, somebody else. But it's impossible to do any of that if we have the attitude of, I just don't want to work. I want to look something easy. So
yeah.
I love that about your story.
Yeah, definitely the working less or 5 hours a week or 10 hours a week, Tim Ferriss kind of stuff. It might be possible for some people, but I would say on average, it's not, especially in the beginning. And I am glossing over many things that did not work and that I spent time on. And then for your second point, I put it this way, you need to find your investors. And that does not have to mean venture capital. It does not have to mean actual cash that somebody gives you. It can come in the form of a previous boss who now becomes your client, or a client that you had in a different job that is now your first client in your company. In my case, it was that, but it was also the fact that during all of this time, my wife was in grad school and she graduated in 2018. And she obviously knew for years that I was planning and hoping to start my own thing. And so basically, our agreement was, hey, once you graduate, can you start working? And I will then stop at my corporate job and try to start the company. And thankfully, I married well. And so she was willing to do that. And so she was willing to invest in the idea of starting a business. And so we swapped roles in who was paying the bills. Now, that's not going to be possible for everyone, obviously, but that's just an example of who an investor might be. It might be your spouse. And it did take 2 to 3 years to get the business off the ground. And it took 3 to 4 years for the business to really make any money. And now here we are in year 6. And it's okay, now everything works. We have a track record, everything like that. But in a way, it was like I went back to school and we orchestrated that trade. But it definitely wasn't like an immediate thing. Yeah. Funny to
Love
think
it.
about actually.
Yeah, yeah. Okay, so you have now decided to go on your own. Your first client is the people that you were already working for.
Yeah.
It's exciting because you are now on your own. It's also exciting that you already have the first client. But
Yeah.
behind this excitement are many other feelings. What are some
Yeah.
of those?
Obviously, we were broke. Let me restart. We were broke. And part of the reason we were broke is that, at least in service based business, you don't necessarily get paid right away. And you certainly don't get paid ahead of time, right? You do the project, you submit your invoice, then you are maybe a 30-day, 60-day, or 90-day turnaround to get that invoice paid. And that catches people off guard. And in theory, I knew that. But in practicality, 90 days is a long time. right? It's a very long time. And that's assuming there's no mistakes, the invoice is accepted, et cetera, et cetera. We were broke for a very long time to build up that kind of invoice staggering and have multiple projects. That took a long time to build up. And then the other thing was, and goes into the category of things that did not work. Some of the other things that we were doing were purely experimenting. For example, I had been working on writing a kid's book. And so we published a kid's book as part of starting the business. And that was like another thing, Kickstarter and videos and trying to get that into distribution. Then figuring out to make any money with books, you realistically need to sell tens of thousands of copies because you're only making a few dollars per print. When you go buy a book at Barnes & Noble, and let's say the book is $10, Barnes & Noble bought that book for 55% off of retail, right? They bought that book for, let's say, $9, maybe $10. And then, of course, so from that $10, you, of course, have to print the book. You have to fulfill it. There's a cut to the actual distributor, things like that. So by the end, you're maybe getting $3, $4 per unit per book. So you just do a quick math, right? If you want to make any salary that equals the salary that you would earn, you need to sell tens of thousands of copies, which I think my book is pretty cool, but it wasn't going to sell tens of thousands of copies, right? So stuff like that. We experimented with publishing. For a little while, we tried producing online classes. So this was the era of masterclass with like celebrities. So the idea was to do a design class, the name of the project. And so we recorded a bunch of classes with different artists and designers and things like that. And we were going to try to do like a subscription. And we ended up getting some relatively famous people. In the end, we got Ben Abbott, who is one of the people on the History Channel Forged in Fire show. We produced a class for him. That one, I'll speak about that one for a second. In business, there's always false positives. So his class, it's an example of a limited or false positive. For example, we launched this class and we sold like $10,000 in one day. And you're like, holy crap, $10,000. And so your mind starts, wow, if we do $10,000 every day, we're going to be millionaires and this is going to be great. And we can start like a whole production company. And then you realize the only reason it sold that much is that it's Christmas and people are buying it for their husbands and cousins and wives and whatever. You're not going to do that on January 2 or January 3 or even all of January, February, and March when like really nobody is buying gifts during those months, right?
Yeah.
So then when your sales go down and fall 90%, you quickly realize that no, this is a decent, you might make a few 10, 20, $30,000, but you are not going to be making hundreds of thousands of dollars. You're not going to be making millions. And you won't necessarily be repeating this every year because once you sell the class, that's it, right? You either need to sell a new class or start some sort of subscription. So it's an example of a business that's hard to keep the engine going, which is why like software, right? You have a subscription that part of that is so that it can keep the engine going rather than how software used to be back in the day where you just buy it one time. So there were a lot of lessons learned about how to make films, how to make curriculums, how to do publishing, all of this stuff just jammed into the 2018 through 20 years. And from a financial perspective, none of it worked. But it was definitely it was an adventure, and I do miss some of it in like a wow, that was a creative time kind of way, but not necessarily in oh man, we're super broke.
There's always fun projects that help us feel good, but sometimes it doesn't work out financially. I'm curious, are all the businesses that you started, or whether it be writing a book or trying this masterclass app type of thing, were they all self-funded? Did you raise any money? Did you take any loans?
No, all self-funded. Yeah. I have never raised any money from anyone, never sold any part of the business. We have a credit line and things like that just for operational costs. And we have credit cards and things like that we've used, especially in those early days when we were taking a lot of risks, put it on a credit card basically and pay it off with the money that we're making from the master planning projects. So that was one blessing, right? We pretty much consistently from the beginning always had master planning projects happening. And so those projects were just enough to pay for all of the experiments, but I did not pay myself. So I'm trying to think, I did not pay myself until maybe like 2021. So 2.5 3 years almost, I personally did not remove any money from the business. So I think there was that huge, and this goes back to the investment time with my wife, right? She invested the time to support our family while I figured all that out. But yeah, it's definitely a journey, but it was all self-funded, all kind of self-orchestrated. Like I did learn how to record videos and become a better videographer and editor and all those kinds of things, much like the programming, but a little bit more visually creative. Those are all skills that I use now. We do videos now for clients here and there, and it's no problem because I already know how to do all of it. In fact, I know how to do a more complicated version of it. So whatever we make for these people is easy in
Easy.
comparison.
Yeah. Fantastic. So you go to this endeavor, masterclass, it gets a really high false positive, tens of thousands of dollars at Christmas. You have the
Yeah.
realization, wait a second, this is not sustainable. This is not going to happen.
So I think the timeline, of course, in retrospect seems crisp, but in reality, it's all kind of hazy and fuzzed in there. But in the basic form, we had continued, or I had continued to work with my previous boss and previous company on these master plans. And after we went through some of the false positives of publishing and design class and things like that, I had this kind of moment where I was like, the only thing that's really worked consistently and where I believe there's room to grow is this master planning stuff. And just like the experiments of publishing and the experiments of online classes, I ran an experiment of can we grow this business? And that sounds much fancier than it really actually was. But basically, I reached out to my clients and different partners and said, why aren't we taking on more projects? Let's push to take on more. I have the capacity to take on more. Here's what I'm hoping we can accomplish. Let's do it. And then basically every time anyone asked if I was interested, I said yes. So it was a mixture of intentionally reaching out, but also accepting what came in. And that's when things really changed. So in 2021, we did, let's say, 1, 2 projects. 2022, we did 4. 2023, we did 6. So it's every year since then, we've been able to dramatically increase the amount of clients, work, revenue, everything related to those master planning projects. And so the experiment, I could tell right away, like within a few months, I could tell right away that the experiment was working. And so we just kept pushing with it. And even now, we're thinking of ways that we can keep going with it.
So if you had to name one thing, just one thing that played the biggest role in your success in your latest endeavor, which is the company that you're successfully running right now, is it risk taking? Is it hard work? Is it taking the initiative and just knocking on doors until someone answers?
A
What
little bit of
is
that.
it? Yeah. What is that one thing that you think, yeah, all of these elements are needed to create this beautiful picture? But what
Yeah.
was the main color that was used on the canvas?
I think if I could boil it down to one thing, which I'd be honest, I'm not 100% sure it's a positive thing yet, but I think it's stressing the strategy, right? So in a lot of work, especially we'll say like high-end service or consulting work, you can do the job, right? You can write the report, you can design the thing, whatever. But when you stress the strategy, I think it's more about seeing the individual project in the context of where you're going. And when you look at, like, I'll just use architecture because I'm familiar with that field. But if you look at the really good world famous architects, let's say from the last century, these are people who escaped Germany, came to the US, worked in Chicago, worked in New York, were immigrants, or started from nothing. And you're like, wow, how did you end up designing skyscrapers in Chicago and that kind of stuff? And if you look a little bit closer, all of their work formed some type of cohesive direction to something. And it can start off really humble and then it gets a little bit cooler and then a little bit cooler and then like you end at the top. And I think that's where we are at. We started with the books and the videos and then there were a few projects and they were like, okay, can we move one level up? And so we have more projects, but now we apply lessons from programming. We apply lessons from web design, from video production, from publishing even. We worked on a book called called Healthy While Homeless, for example. It was a nonprofit project, and we published this booklet, and it was handed out to, I want to say, 20,000 people experiencing homelessness in Southern California. It would have been hard to do that project if we had not messed around with creating kids' books. So even though it's not necessarily obvious all the time, I think if you can stack your skills and stress the strategy between each step, hopefully all of that is possible and you start going in a direction that you want to go. For example, now we just created a piece of software called Engage that is a specialty survey tool where you can use like sticky notes. You can send people sticky note surveys and they can click anywhere on the image and they can leave their survey and write or type their sticky note. And so it takes this kind of in-person activity but makes it digital. So it's a free tool. Anyone can go to engagebygo.com and use it. And that tool we coded, I designed everything in-house to solve some of the problems that we face with our master plan clients and with all the community members. I'm not sure I would have the knowledge of how to make that software if I hadn't in 2015 through 17 learned how to program and learned about UI and UX and all the other design elements. And even though I'm not like the best programmer and I tons of stuff I don't know, I have a foundation that I couldn't build on from 6, 7 years ago.
Yeah.
So I'm not sure we would be able to accomplish that unless I had messed around with that 8 years ago. So I think people need to really like take the whole day, take multiple days and spread it out. Take several days a month just in general to think about how everything you're doing is hopefully in some way stacking on each other. And it's going to feel like wasted time. And honestly, like we're working on a project right now and I have 3 Word docs and like a huge notebook, and I don't know if it's the right way to go. I'm not sure it's worth the thousands of dollars and hundreds of hours to run this experiment, but it's at least worth a couple of hours during this week to go through every detail that I can think of. Yesterday, I had lunch with a good friend who's also in the field. I talked to one of my teammates on Tuesday about it. I even talk to my wife about it to see what she thinks. Like the answer may be no, we may not do it, or we may do it and give it a try for 6 months and see how it goes. But at least I'm spending a lot of time to see if it fits within the stack. And so I would suggest that to a lot of people, like actually stress the strategy. And if you don't have one, then figure something out because you're not going to go much of anywhere if you're always just going off in different corners. I know
Yeah.
that was a very long answer, but
No, it's a
something
very
along those
good
lines.
answer. It's a very good answer because there are two things. There is stressing the strategy, like you said, which is consciously and actively planning ahead based on previous skill sets acquired and lessons learned. But
Yeah.
then you also said earlier about there were so many projects that you took on and so many endeavors that you had that didn't go anywhere. And being able to still take something from each of those failed endeavors to be able to connect the dots and then somehow make something out of it. I think that's exactly where it's at.
Yeah.
There is so much criticism about people who are jack of all trades because that's not the way to be. If you have your hands in this and this and this, now you get labels put on you like ADD and ADHD and can't focus and this and that. But in reality, if you don't have your hands in multiple pots, you will never grab the things that you need to grab to build something that is your own. And your life and your entire life's work has been a testament to really that principle.
Yeah, I mean, in a nicely packaged way. I will say it doesn't often feel like that. Like you do have, I forget which book it was, but the main phrase of the book was see things from the balcony. So get the long-term picture. And sometimes it's hard. You're not really on the balcony. You're like on the ground, like in the middle of it. You're like, oh man. But yeah, few times a year, or every couple of years, you really get the balcony view. And it's nice.
Majestic.
Yeah.
So what's happening in your life right now? What's going on with the company? You obviously talked about the Engage project. What else is happening?
So, a couple of things. So, we created Engage last year, survey tool. So, we opened it up so anyone can use it. It's a free tool. We're curious to see if it is useful for people outside of the architecture world. So, I would say that's a primary thing is bringing attention to that. Also, within our more core business, we're always writing little bits of software to improve it, but we're also now starting to get into the, we'll say, legal side of it. So, architecture and, of course, construction has a lot of legal components, and it's not really a world that we touched on, but we want to see if there is a way to make our offering even better and more distinct. In a way, we still face the challenge of, aside from maybe the technology that we've created, outside of that, most other architecture or we'll say planning firms can do a similar product. They can do the service and come out with something that's at least similar, right? You would recognize it as the same. We need to get away from that. I don't want to just spend my career pursuing something that's a commodity. And how do we differentiate what we offer from others? And there's a couple ways. Everyone immediately goes to, oh, patent this. That's not necessarily always the right approach. Or trademark. Okay, maybe that's one. Or is it diversify? Or is it bring multiple things into one? When you think of Zillow, right? It's bringing house discovery and real estate agents and selling, and it's bringing a lot of components into one platform. One of the reasons why Zillow is a huge platform or things like that. So could we combine services or more of a one-stop shop for our client? So we're exploring those options. How do we do that? How do we afford to do that? Or what experiment can we run? As you could probably tell, we run a lot of experiments, usually for about 6 to 12 months. For example, Engage was an experiment that started last June or so. What experiment that can we run that's decently affordable? And then outside of that too, we don't really have any digital component right now in terms of, we don't do books anymore. We don't do online classes, things like that. So we're debating, is there something that we can do that's a little bit more fun, a little bit more educational, maybe helps us connect with other people in our industry, people that don't know a lot about architecture. So also playing around with those ideas.
Love it.
We'll see.
Love it.
Mhm.
Joshua, your life, your work, your attitude, and the way you go about pursuing things, connecting the dots. It's amazing. It's
Mm.
amazing. There is no
Thanks.
secret behind why you are where you are. For somebody who graduated only 10 years ago and 3 years ago, still 3 years after graduation, was still working for someone else. It took you 7 years to build this company.
Yeah.
And you weren't born with a golden spoon in your mouth. Things didn't come easy. You had curiosity, you had hard work, you had the tenacity to figure it out. And you have built a life for yourself, creating value through a business that you can call your own. It
Yeah.
is a
It's been fun.
pleasure to meet you, and it was a pleasure to have you on my show. Thank you so much for being here, for giving us your time, and helping our audience understand what it takes to be a real entrepreneur.
I appreciate it. Thanks. I appreciate it a lot.